Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me this evening for part 4 of our story, because isn't it getting exciting? I always love stories and the build-up, because we've all got this question, I'm sure that you have too, wondering what on earth happened to Isla. Why on earth was she struggling and fighting for her life in the ocean? Did someone push her in there, or was it an accident? Hopefully we're not going to find out. Well, we're going to find out very soon, I'm quite sure about that. So let's continue with our story. The way my grandmother is talking about me, it's almost as if she's talking about somebody else that I don't know, and wouldn't want to know either. Someone who didn't care in upsetting the apple cart of somebody else's marriage. I almost feel empathy for my mother being angry with me, having an affair with a married man. But despite her strong religious convictions, I think she was wrong to throw me out of her home. She sounds as if she's rather judgmental. And as for my father, why does he not stand up to her and fight my corner for me? I'm his daughter, am I not? When I'm looking at events objectively, it seems ridiculous. Why would I ever get embroiled with a married man? What about his children? I had been babysitting them. Didn't I care about them? Why was I so willing to be seduced by the father of these children? Looking at things objectively, it seems ridiculous. Why on earth would I get embroiled with a married man? And what about his poor children that I'd been babysitting? Did I not care about their welfare? Why was I so willing to be seduced by the father of these kids? Looking at things from the outside in, as if gazing through a window pane, like Scrooge did in the Christmas Carol, when he was taken by the ghost of Christmas past, to see what his actions were like on the others involved in his life, and it wasn't pretty. I didn't need the ghost of Christmas past to get a rather unpleasant view over the life I had just lived. I didn't like what I was seeing. As if my grandmother was reading my very thoughts, she said to me, "It's not your fault, my dear. You don't know what that man was like. You should have seen the romantic poetry he kept writing for you. It was over the top, and as I said, half of the flowery writing was not even his own. But he still chose to take credit for it, which affirms to me his natural dishonesty. You were grievously upset because he kept telling you he was going to leave that wife of his, and that he'd tell her about you, but he never ever did. I told you myself that he was never going to leave his wife. As I told you, I saw the family one time together at a bowling green. He pretended not to see me, you know. I saw him with his wife, and he looked very happy. So I'm telling you, that woman had absolutely no idea he was cheating on her. I saw her in the ladies' room at the bowling green, and I told her what a lovely family she had. She proceeded to tell me how wonderful her husband Drew was. She was oblivious to the affair. So none of this is your fault, my dear." I look at my grandmother through bleary, bewildered eyes. I can't believe I caused so much upset to everybody. I have no memory of those events, but I hope to do things differently from now on, I said. I certainly don't want to be involved with a married man, especially when I can't remember. It ends now. Please tell the nurses that if Drew Sanguistine comes to the hospital to visit me, I do not want to see him. My grandmother looks very pleased by my words. "Well, isn't that a turn-up for the books? I'm so glad to see that you're seeing things differently now. When I told him you were washed up the beach because he phoned me, you know, and that you were suffering from retrograde amnesia, he was very concerned about you, told me he wanted to visit you. I said he wasn't welcome to do that at all. So he wasn't pleased with me, let me tell you. All of a sudden, a nurse came into the room with a warm smile on her face. "Hello, Isla. You have a visitor," she says, beckoning a familiar-looking man into the ward, who the guard on duty allows to enter. My hopes lift because I appeared to be remembering someone, until the nurse introduces the man to me. "This is Mr. Weston Taylor. He was the one, Isla, who found you on the beach. He just wanted to drop by to see how you're doing." Mr. Taylor is standing at my hospital bed. I notice his silvery hair and his familiar profile. He's carrying a huge bouquet of flowers in his hands. It is a generous thing to do to bring me flowers like this, when he doesn't even know me. His charm touches me to the quick. When he sees me with my grandmother, he retracts a little, apologetically, saying, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you already had a visitor. I'll come back another time, shall I?" "Absolutely not," says my grandmother, extending her hand to Weston. "My name is May Holmes. This is my granddaughter, Isla, whom you are the one that kindly rescued on the beach. I can't tell you how grateful I am to you, Mr. Taylor. There are no words of gratitude for what you did. If it were not for you, I dread to think what would have become of my granddaughter," she said, shuddering. "She might not be with us now. What a dreadful thought that is. As far as I'm concerned, Mr. Taylor, you are a hero." "It's very kind of you to say, Mrs. Holmes, but it was nothing. I only did what anyone else would have done in the circumstances. I'm glad I was woken up by the annoying seagulls that morning, and decided to go for a walk extra early on the beach with my dog Trout." "Don't be so humble, Mr. Taylor. In my book, you're a hero, and nothing will persuade me to think otherwise. The name is May. I must insist you call me May," said my grandmother assertively, taking the large bouquet of flowers from Weston and calling a nurse over to put them in a vase. "It's so very kind of you, Mr. Taylor, to buy my granddaughter such a ravishing bouquet of flowers. You really are a perfect gentleman." My grandmother beckons for Weston to sit down. She pulls a chair for him up to the bedside. He looks bemused, his eyes skimming over both me and my grandmother. "I remember you. You're called Weston. Your dog's called Trout. It's about the only thing I do remember," I say. "I recall your dog, Trout, licking me all over my face. Believe it or not, it was a pleasant experience. It made me feel as if I was still alive." "Trout is a very good dog," agreed Weston, "but he can be inclined to be a little naughty. But my life is all the richer with him being in it." "My granddaughter's suffering from retrograde amnesia," my grandmother explained to Weston. "She doesn't remember who she is. She has no memory of me, but she remembers you. How did you come to find her, Mr. Taylor? I'm dying to hear your story." "It's Weston," said Mr. Taylor. "No need to be formal or to call me by my surname. Everybody calls me Weston. It's a long, rather idiosyncratic story, shall we say. But the main thing is I found your granddaughter on the beach when I was taking Trout for his stroll. For a moment I thought your daughter was a mannequin from a shop window, you know the kind. And when you flinched, my dear, I almost had a heart attack on the beach. I got the shock of my life, I did. I genuinely thought you were a doe. Your skin was so waxy." "I'm so sorry," I say. "I didn't mean to scare the bejesus out of you. It's so kind of you to bring me all those flowers, as my grandmother was saying." Weston smiled brightly. "It's only a pleasure. I'm glad you're all right. As I was saying, you gave me quite the scare, you did. For a moment I thought Isla was a mannequin from a shop window. You know the sort.
I was rather befuddled as to why it had been washed up on the beach. I almost had a heart attack when Isla flinched. I got the shock of my life, I did. I genuinely thought you were a doe. Your skin was so waxy.
I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to scare the bejesus out of you. It's so kind of you to bring me all those flowers, by the way, as my grandmother was saying. Very generous. Weston smiled brightly.
It's only a pleasure. I'm glad you're all right. That's the main thing. But you did give me a dreadful scare, you did. For a moment I did not think you were going to make it. You were blue from the cold, but your clothes were surprisingly dry. Do you have any recollection of what happened? Why you ended up on the beach in the first place?
I wish I did, I say. I have a memory of being in the water drowning, and a big black hairy creature with yellow eyes rescuing me, bringing me to the shore and warming me up. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. I think the creature's warm body managed to dry up my clothes. At my preposterous words, my grandmother appears to grow red with embarrassment.
I'm sure, Weston, that Isla here not only has retrograde amnesia, but perhaps she's suffering from a few delusions. You know how cold water can affect you, she says apologetically. It can play all kinds of tricks on the mind. Do you know people with advanced hypothermia sometimes believe they're hot? They begin to throw off their clothes in freezing conditions. I've heard that before, Weston admitted, but I'm quite sure your granddaughter is not delusional. In fact, her story makes perfect sense to me.
Before my grandmother can say anything else, a nurse charges towards us tentatively. I'm so sorry. Visiting hours are up. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Dr. Walensky is insisting that Isla here gets as much sleep as possible. It's not good for her to have too much stimulation when she's recovering her memory. It's a step-by-step process.
That's understandable. We'll go then.
My grandmother slips her arm through Weston's, as if they're an old married couple. I don't know who's more surprised, me or Weston.
Weston, let's go downstairs, shall we, to have some coffee together. I want you to tell me all about you. Are you married?
I can hear Weston telling my grandmother, no, he's not, and that his wife died a short while ago. And then their voices become fainter and fainter and more muted as they finally leave the ward. I am left to digest everything that I've been told. I tell the nurse that under no circumstances do I want to receive any visits from a man called Drew Sanguiston. I return to sleep, wondering what could have induced me ever to get involved with a married man, who had children, and the man was old enough to be my father. Had I really lost leave of my senses? It would seem so. Did I have an Oedipus complex or something? I have no memory of the relationship and no desire to pursue it any further, even though the man's wife is now dead. I feel a tad annoyed with my mother, even though I have no memory of her, but by the sounds of things, she's way too judgmental, condescending and self-righteous. I resent her for being so bigoted in her opinions. I was her daughter, for goodness sake. Why was she so quick to condemn me? I was 18 years old, and teenagers like myself were notorious for making monumental mistakes in their lives, experimenting with drugs, smoking or drinking way too much, and going out of a limb to make some precarious life choices along the way. But that was the quintessential privilege of being a teenager, learning to navigate your way through the stormy twists and turns of life. Everyone seemed to know that, with the exception of my mother. Wasn't it my mother's job to be an anchor for me in my life, a lighthouse that guided me safely to shore when I became adrift and went astray? I wondered privately whether my mother, with her devout Christian beliefs, would go so far as to wantonly harm me. Surely not. I was certain someone had tried to harm me. I'd ended up drowning in the ocean. I had sustained a large bump on the back of my head. Even if the police assumed it was an accident, I didn't believe it to be so.
The only two people that were furious with me were likely Drew Sanguistine's wife if she'd found out about my affair with her husband, but she couldn't have been responsible for what had happened to me, given she was now deceased. But my mother was very much alive. She was also angry with me for having the affair with Drew Sanguistine in the first place. I had no way of knowing what my mother was capable of. Would she consider it serving God by taking me down to a watery grave? It was always a possibility. Let's not kid. So many things were done in the name of religion, in order to honour God. But there was nothing honourable about killing someone to right a wrong. Yet some people considered it noble to kill for God. What had my mother said to my grandmother in the grocery store? What does the dark have in common with the light? Do I know you? It would seem my mother thought my grandmother was a heathen for taking me under her charge. But in the grand scheme of things, my grandmother was the one who'd shown me compassion and unconditional love, even if she privately disapproved of some of my less than desirable life choices. It was going to be tough to pick up the pieces of my life again, to make sense of everything, but trying to be a sleuth like Nancy Drew was not helping me in any way make sense of what had happened to me. It would seem a couple of days later that Dr. Walensky assured me confidently that I was well enough to go home, and was to learn that my grandmother and Weston were spending a lot of time together. "He's a lovely man," my grandmother told me. "Such a hero for rescuing you on the beach. He does remind me of your late grandfather, you know. And by the way, I failed to mention, he believes your story about being rescued by a big black thing with yellow eyes. He said he believed a male Bigfoot saved your life. He told me an extraordinary story about how he encountered a male Bigfoot on the beach that morning, when he found you tangled up in seaweed. Weston does not believe he would have noticed the lump of rags on the beach had it not been for the Bigfoot who pointed you out. Isn't that an incredible story?" It was indeed an incredible story, and I was now absolutely certain that it was a Bigfoot that had saved me from drowning in the perilous icy cold waters of the ocean. The creature had held me to his powerful chest and kept me lovely and warm. He fit the profile of what I'd encountered amidst my foggy recollections, clouded by a vague obscurity. But I do remember those kind yellow eyes, the reassuring voice in my head that affirmed to me that all would be well, and that he'd sent help for me in the screams of the seagulls. Had not Weston said that the seagulls had woken him up, so that he had ventured out onto the beach extra early? Had the Bigfoot encouraged the gulls to scream out loud that morning, to wake up an unsuspecting sleeper like Weston? It was a distinct possibility. "You like Weston, don't you?" I asked my grandmother teasingly. "That's an understatement, my dear," my grandmother said. "The moment he walked into the hospital ward, my heart began to pound like it did when I was a teenager, when I first met your grandfather. Weston's wife died recently, you know. He loved her so much, talks about her all the time so fondly, how much he misses her. I think he's enjoying my company, and I enjoy being his friend, you know. He doesn't know many people in these parts. He's originally from Houston in Texas, you see. He moved here to be close to the ocean. He lives in a modern house that's very state-of-the-art on the beach, which is not his thing, really. But the place has excellent ocean views. It would be nice if our friendship turned a tad romantic, because we both need companionship at our age. I think he's warming to me, you know. I've just got to show him that I'm worth having around, like his lovable dog Trout. I'm sure he'll see sense soon, I say with a twinkle in my eyes, hoping with all my heart things will work out between my grandmother and Weston. From what she told me, my grandfather had been dead for over 15 years. He died very suddenly from reasons unknown. It happens, my grandmother had told me. It's called sudden death syndrome for adults. The coroner had no explanation as to why he died. as my husband was a very healthy man, you know. No health problems. He kept himself very fit and always watched his diet.
That was weird, him dying like that, I said. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. When I moved into my grandmother's house, nothing looked remotely familiar to me. Dr. Walensky had warned me that this would probably be the case, but it was very unsettling, not recognizing a single thing. It would seem that my retrograde amnesia had decided to vindictively set up shop in my mind, consuming everything, taking over everything, so I had no memory of anything at all, and that included my grandmother's white Maltese poodle Mopsy, and her beautiful fluffy white Persian cat with blue eyes called Henry VIII, who rubbed his long sleek coat against me as if he knew me very well. My bedroom in my grandmother's house boasted a faded poster of Justin Timberlake on the wall. My clothes and my things gave me no indication about who I was, and my life before my amnesia. My grandmother tried desperately to fill in the blanks for me, showing me photograph albums so that strangers and pictures began to become like a story in my head that was beginning to make some kind of sense. My amnesia was driving me completely potty, but my grandmother's warm heart made me feel as if I was warmly loved and belonged in my strange enigmatic existence, which was like a topsy-turvy jigsaw puzzle that I was trying to piece together bit by bit. My grandmother had thought it better I did not return to college or to my friends until my memory returned, and I was so glad about that. Even Dr. Walensky had saliently advised for me to take things extra slowly in the beginning, or everything would become far too overwhelming for me. He was right, for every day presented for me brand new challenges that I had to overcome. I felt like a horse galloping around an obstacle course, wondering when I was going to knock over some of the obstacles in my path, rather than glide over them seamlessly. Worse still, I was always looking over my shoulders, wondering if someone was out there, watching and waiting, someone who clandestinely wished to harm me for some reason. If they found out I was alive and well, would they come after me again? Would they try and hurt me? Would they try and kill me? My grandmother had not been there over that weekend. She had left me at her house in town and taken a flight to Fairbanks in Alaska to stay with her sister Beryl for the weekend.
I needed to see my sister, she explained. Beryl was celebrating her 80th birthday in Fairbanks, so how could I not go to that party? You agreed to stay behind to look after the animals. You know, Beryl looked marvellous for her age. Sharp as a hawk she is. We had a fabulous time. But when I returned to the house, you were gone, which was most unlike you. Thankfully, Mopsy and Henry VIII were absolutely fine. I had a profound sense that something was very wrong, so I went to report your absence to the police after phoning anyone I could think of, including your boyfriend, Drew Sanguistine, to ask them if they knew of your whereabouts. But everybody claimed they had seen no sight or sound of you. I had no doubt, my dear, that you would get up to all kinds of mischief while I was away. But I was fine with that. I'd have probably done much the same myself at your age. What do they say? While the cat's away, the mouse doth play. I did advise you not to go and see Drew Sanguistine, not after he'd recently lost his wife. I persuaded you that you needed to give your boyfriend time to grieve over his wife, but you claimed he wouldn't be upset that she was dead. But I told you it was very important to give him space, especially for the sake of those children that have lost their mother. To respect that. I'd like to think you listened to my advice, but I can't be sure if you did or didn't.
I said that to you, I gasped. Was I really that heartless? I mean, those poor children. They lost their mother, and I'm selfishly thinking what I stand to gain, now that my boyfriend's wife is out of the way.
You're painting me out to be an absolute monster, Granny. My grandmother shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. You've always had a good heart, Isla, but you had blinders on your eyes as far as Drew Sanguiston was concerned. You'd have walked to the edge of the earth for that man. Even though— My grandmother stops in mid-sentence, as if wondering whether it was wise to pursue the conversation. Even though what? I ask, coaxing her to continue. My grandmother begins to play with her pearls around her neck, in a self-soothing gesture, as clearly she's not comfortable talking about Drew Sanguiston. It's blindingly clear to me she didn't like him at all. Do you really want me to continue? She asked gingerly. I'm not sure, my dear, that I should. Please go on, Granny. I insist. Well, I don't always feel— Well, actually, I do. I don't know how to put it, my dear, but I got the sense that Drew Sanguiston was always playing with you, like a cat toying with a mouse, if you know what I mean. That his intentions were never honourable or pure. He kept assuring you he'd tell his wife about your relationship. But it speaks volumes, don't you think, that he never ever did? I knew he was never going to leave his wife. He liked to have his cake and eat it. And I genuinely believe he loved his wife. And if he had to choose between her and you— I hate to say this, my love, but he would have chosen her, I'm most sure. You, Isla, with your endearing, sweet, whimsical naivety, believed everything he told you. You always made so many excuses for the man as to why he hadn't told his wife about the affair. I think when his wife died of that massive stroke, tragic it really was it not? You thought that you and Drew were meant to be together. You were excited about the future that you saw as incredibly rosy. But I'm sure that that man would never have committed to you, not even after his wife's death. I really don't think he would have. As my grandmother was talking about me, it felt like she was describing a fictitious character in a novel that many readers would literally love to hate, my being one of them. The babysitter who has an affair with the husband and willfully chooses to destroy a marriage and upset 2 children. I would not be the kind of character many would warm to. The more my grandmother talked about my stinking presumptuous attitude and obvious fixation on Drew Sanguiston, the more I despised the person who was supposed to be me. I never liked your boyfriend, my grandmother continued. He knew I loathed him. I told him he was playing games with you, Isla, stringing you along, and that he had no intention of leaving his wife for you. That's what you want her to believe, isn't it? I told him. You want her to believe that you're going to marry her. It's none of your business, he said to me. Isla is old enough and ugly enough to make her own choices. I don't need an old bat like you interfering in our lives. I told him it was my business because I was your grandmother. She's a big girl, you old bat. If she scrapes her knee, she doesn't need you to nurse it better for her. Leave us alone. Keep your big fat grubby nose out of our personal business, will you? Well, I think it's about time that your wife knows exactly what's going on with my granddaughter, Drew. I think she should be informed about this, don't you? You think you should tell her, do you, old bat? Leave my wife out of this, do you understand? She doesn't need to know about any of this. And if you dare say a thing, I will kill you. You understand? I will kill you. He said that to you? I asked in astonishment. He did more. He threatened me by slicing his finger across his throat, as if to say, you're a dead woman. if you dare say anything to my wife."
I decided, as my grandmother confided in me about Drew, that he must be an arrogantly cocky individual who had feelings of grandiosity and only cared about himself. It affirmed to me that I didn't want to see him again, even though I had absolutely no memory of him. I was privately relieved the nurses had sent Drew Sanguistine away when he visited me at the hospital with a large bouquet of flowers. They told him I had no memory of him, and in the circumstances I did not wish to see him. He had thrown a fit in the hospital, and the flowers he'd brought across the floor in the reception area and stormed out. The nurse I spoke to described him as not a very nice man, and belligerently capricious. My parents did come to visit me one day at my grandmother's house, when my grandmother persuaded them to pay me a visit. My mother was incredibly reluctant to see me, but my grandmother told her that I had changed after my fortuitous, unfortunate accident out at sea, and had completely lost my memory. Furthermore, she had assured her that I was repentant about having an affair with a married man, and that I did not wish to see him at all. He had had a hissy fit, throwing the flowers he'd brought me across the floor of the hospital reception, and storming out. The nurse I spoke to described him as a capriciously belligerent, not very nice man. My parents did come to visit me one day when I was living at my grandmother's house. My grandmother persuaded them to pay me a visit. My mother was very reluctant about coming, but my grandmother told her I'd changed after my fortuitous, unfortunate accident, and had completely lost my memory. Furthermore, she assured her that I was extremely repentant about having an affair with a married man, and that I'd seen the error of my ways. My mother arrived with my father at my grandmother's house, and once again I was staring at two strangers I did not know. It was incredibly uncomfortable, and I felt very self-conscious. I was hoping I'd have some memory of them, but my mind was a blank canvas yet to be painted. I liked my father immediately. He had a warm, loving personality. My grandmother's kind blue eyes were in his face, and he immediately swept me in my arms lovingly. He was so thrilled to see me, and there were tears in his eyes. I knew at once he loved me.
"Oh, it's good to see you, love. How are you feeling, Isla?" he said. "I've been worried sick about you, I have. What is this about you nearly drowning in the ocean, sustaining a nasty bump on your head? You poor, poor thing."
My father immediately let go of his hold of me when he realized that I was becoming rigidly uncomfortable and stiff in his all-embracing, effusive hug.
"I apologize. You don't remember me, do you, Isla? I'm being far too familiar. It's just so good to see you, love. I can hardly contain my emotions, but I understand that you don't remember me. How are you feeling? Are the police any closer to knowing exactly what happened to you?" "I'm afraid no one knows what happened to poor Isla here. It's an absolute mystery. I think even the police are confounded. But they've reached the conclusion that it was probably an accident. Maybe Isla slipped over some rocks, fell into the ocean for a while, knocked her head. But she couldn't have been in the water for very long. Otherwise she would almost certainly have died." "But what if it wasn't an accident?" said my father. "The police need to take this seriously. What if someone was purposely trying to hurt our daughter? If anyone hurts Isla, I'll kill them myself. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to find out what's going on here."
"There's no need to get upset and to overreact," said my grandmother. "Maybe the answers will be forthcoming when Isla's memory is restored. The doctor thinks it'll soon be back."
"The sooner the better," says my father, looking at me sympathetically. "You poor thing, Isla. I can only imagine how daunting it must be, not to even remember who you are."
"It's not easy, I admit. It's a struggle for me every day, trying to make sense of everything." My mother is staring at me through critical dark brown eyes, which she's rolling in the back of her head in exasperation.
"Oh, Eric, for goodness shut up? Get a grip. Stop fussing over Isla like this. You're making a spectacle of yourself.
My grandmother gestured for my mother to sit down on a comfortable wing chair, covered in pretty floral design in her living room, while she rattled around with her Royal Dalton cups and saucers on the coffee table. She looked a tad nervous, and was eyeing my mother suspiciously through narrowing eyes, as if considering dealing with my mother was like navigating her way very gingerly around a volatile hand grenade that had the potential to go off quite explosively.
"It's good to see you, Margaret," she said to my mother coyly. "How have you been, my dear?"
I noticed that my grandmother did not hug my mother, nor did she give her a couple of affectionate kisses on the cheek, like you would normally do when you welcome someone into your home, which suggested to me that there was no love lost between the two of them. My grandmother busied herself with a tea tray, as a convenient, useful distraction, while my mother raised a cynical brow as she studied my grandmother through a calculating gaze.
"It's kind of you to ask, Tilly. I felt better, I will confess. In truth, I don't appreciate you dragging me around here to see my daughter. What on earth would I want to see Isla for, after the dreadful things she's put me through, as well as her father? I'm Christian, Tilly, and my daughter has brought shame upon our family. Have you got any idea what it feels like?"
My grandmother ignored my mother's thorny words and said very quietly,
"I'm very glad you came, Margaret. Very glad indeed. Grateful to you I am. It's important for Isla to see you in the circumstances. She has no memory of the both of you, so it was very significant for her to meet you, so she can put the pieces of her life together and make sense of things, you know. Now let me pour you some tea. I know you take yours without sugar, Margaret,"
said my grandmother. She began busily pouring my parents' tea with trembling fingers, and offering around plates of sandwiches and chocolate brownies. But my parents ignored her. They both had their beady eyes pinned on me, like the people on an audience at a theatre, waiting for the curtains to be drawn for the play to start. My mother's eyes were judgmental. My father's were kind and benevolent, misted over with tears, as if he was so touched to see me again. Ostensibly, the atmosphere in the living room was so tense you could have cut it with a knife, as my mother looked like a formidable ice queen. When she'd entered the room, it certainly felt like the temperature in the room had become significantly colder. My mother looked at me with disgust, like you might look towards a dead frog that you were about to dissect in a biology experiment. My mother's dark brown hair was worn neatly in an old-fashioned 60s beehive style above her head. Her face was long, her lips narrow, her cheeks rather sunken. She was a thin woman, wearing a well-fitting tweed jacket and matching pencil skirt, with a sensible pair of no-nonsense brogues on her feet. My mother's formidable, calculating face was devoid of makeup, apart from a very soft peach lipstick on her lips. She stared at me insouciantly through her dark hooded eyes, with a large frown that developed on her face.
"So look what the ocean dragged in with the seaweed," she said coldly. "You're very lucky, Isla, that the good Lord regurgitated you on the beach like that. Spared your life, he did. He showed mercy to you, that you did not deserve, my girl. But we have a merciful God, willing to give second chances. I, on the other hand, am not so accommodating," she said scathingly. "Did I not warn you, Isla, that getting involved with a married man would stir up the Lord's wrath? Look what's happened to you. You very nearly died, and now you don't even remember who you are. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic."
"I'm so sorry," I say to my mother obsequiously, "about everything that happened, all the upset I caused you. You have every right to be aggrieved with me."
"I would prefer it if you didn't call me Mum," said my mother. "There's no intimacy between the two of us. My name is Mrs. Holmes. I prefer to be addressed like that."
"I have no memory of my affair, Mrs. Holmes," I say to my mother, "but I'm really sorry for the record about what happened.
You're right. I should never have got involved with a married man. It was wrong of me. I'm sorry about it. I genuinely am. I genuinely wanted my mother to forgive me, and for us at least to try and get along. It seemed nonsensical that a daughter and mother were at loggerheads with each other, and in some way I wanted to make amends. It's difficult to feel any animosity towards someone when you have no memory. My mother seemed taken aback by my confession. "Well, well, well, isn't that a turn-up for the books?" she says, wringing her hands together. "A repentant heart indeed. I never expected that from you, Isla. You've never been repentant before. What was it you said to me? I don't care what you think, Mum. I love him." "I told you, Margaret. Isla here is very sorry for what happened. She regrets some of the choices she made," said my grandmother. "She may be sorry now," said my mother cynically, "but it's easy to be sorry if you have no memory. But when Isla's memory returns, she will return to that dreadful, dreadful man, like a dog returns to its vomit. I blame you, Isla, for what happened to Mrs. Sanguistine. It's because of you she is dead." So there we are. That is the end of part 4. Part 5 is tomorrow night, and it's getting very, very exciting. And we're going to find out very soon who was responsible for hurting Isla. So I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.